Good afternoon, bonjour. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at Carleton University in snowy Ottawa, Canada. And I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and other parts of the world, but especially focused on needs and opportunities identified by our working groups in East Africa and the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity building, policy engagement, and public dialogue like this, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am currently is unceded Algonquin territory. I say that not just out of respect and courtesy, but out of recognition that while today we are talking about the role of North America within the global refugee regime, that these issues of dispossession and dislocation are very much a part of the territory where I currently find myself. With that, I'd like to say how delighted I am to welcome some 200 participants from around the world to this webinar as part of the Global Academic Conference reflecting on UNHCR's 70th anniversary. In this panel, we're joined by a remarkable group of speakers that reflect on different dynamics of how North American actors, both state actors, civil society actors, research actors, can more fully engage in the global refugee regime, that set of norms and institutions that are designed to help ensure protection and find solutions both with and for refugees. I'm also delighted to be moderating today with Julie Crowley, who is the regional director for the International Development Research Center in West and Central Africa. Julie brings very important perspectives to this, and she'll share some of IDRC's thoughts on this in a moment. Let me note that this webinar is in view only, so please use the Q&A function to pose questions that we'll be taking later in the webinar after we hear from our speakers. Please also be respectful of the positions of the speakers when posing questions. And I remind you that hurtful or harmful language will result in you being removed from this webinar. Second, I'd also like to note, as you see on the screen, that if you have any technical questions or concerns, please send any concerns to learn@carleton.ca so that we can help resolve them. And please also follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag UNHCR70 and by tagging @learning to follow us there on Twitter. Finally, you'll receive a survey after this webinar. Please let us know what you think. And within about a week's time, the recording of this webinar will be posted on LERRN's website, and that will be included in the survey there. I hope you enjoy this webinar. Wherever you are joining us from, I hope you're safe and well. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. And with that, I'm delighted to give the floor to my co-moderator today, Julie Crowley. Julie, over to you, please.
Thank you, James, for the introduction. It is a privilege for IDRC to be partnering with LERRN in this important webinar. In fact, the IDRC LERRN collaboration is rather well established, as this is the 4th webinar of a series. And we also have a long-standing research partnership on forced displacement. So it is my honor to moderate this panel with you today and to welcome our distinguished experts. We have with us the Honorable Bob Ray, Mr. Mustafa Alio, Mrs. Anna Makuze, Mrs. Leah Zamore, Professor Elizabeth Ferris, and Professor Jennifer Bond. I also extend a warm welcome to all participants whom I believe are connected or still connecting from several continents. Today's event is significant in that we are also commemorating the UN High Commission for Refugees' 70th anniversary. It goes without saying that it's not celebrating per se. As the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, recently said, he looks forward to a time when UNHCR is no longer needed and so do we. But we still want to take advantage of this day to recognize all the achievements of UNHCR to promote durable solutions for refugees in a global context that is becoming ever more challenging. Allow me to say a few words about IDRC. For 50 years now, we have been funding research in developing countries. We do so to promote growth, reduce poverty, and drive large-scale positive change. We are a Canadian Crown Corporation, and our activities are part of Canada's broad range of international assistance. Our approach is to increase opportunities for all by supporting leading thinkers to advance knowledge and solve practical development problems. We also provide resources, advice, and training, enabling the implementation and the sharing of solutions with those who need them most. In a few weeks, IDRC will be launching its new 10-year strategy, which aligns with the SDGs and intends on strengthening the Global South leadership, which also includes a focus on issue of forced displacements. So I invite you to stay tuned for the upcoming launch. We are here today to discuss the North American perspective on realizing protection and solution for refugees, as well as to discuss North American engagement in the global refugee regime. We feel truly privileged to have such leading experts with us for the discussion, and I thank you for accepting our invitation. Today's event is also recognizing the importance of bringing the voices of refugees in all research on issues related to refugees, and to ensure their full participation and to encourage their leadership in strengthening programs addressing these issues, as well as in the global refugee system. There is much to learn from North American experiences in receiving and welcoming refugees, and there is much to learn from the perspectives of refugees and host countries in the Global South in a way that it can inform North America's journey. We all want to know what works, what doesn't not, and why it does not work. The experiences of refugees in the Global South, where the majority of the forcibly displaced reside, can nourish scholars and practitioners based in North America. Such mutual learning and exchanges in partnership with refugees also contribute to ensure justice, dignity, and well-being for refugees, which I believe we are all committed to. Moreover, there are challenges of a similar nature in North America and in the Global South. The growing negative and toxic narrative about refugees and the forcibly displaced is a particularly salient one. We all need to think about what can be done to counter misinformation and break down the unfounded myth about these vulnerable populations. For IDRC, for the greater benefit of all, this should be done in partnership with refugees and refugee communities. But I will stop here as I look forward to what promises to be a very rich discussion. So over to you, James, and our guests.
Thank you very much, Julie. Merci beaucoup. The collaboration with IDRC on this issue is so exciting. And your words about IDRC's engagement on these issues as part of the 10-year plan is really exciting and I think great cause for hope. In framing our interventions for this panel, I think there's some context that might be useful. We traditionally think of North American states as being leaders in the functioning of the refugee regime, and this goes back to the very beginning, 70 years ago, when states gathered to negotiate what a new UN agency with a mandate for refugees, what that would look like. There were competing views, and it was the view of North American actors that prevailed in terms of the limits and the parameters of what UNHCR was able to do. And through the early years of the regime, we saw the growth of UNHCR's, both its mandate and the scope of its activities, was really reliant on US funding and support. And over the past 5 years, we've seen how the US and Canada have together resettled more refugees than all other countries in the world combined. And despite what we've seen over the past 4 years, the US remains the single largest donor to UNHCR, contributing over 35% of its budget. But it's really important to note that when we think of the contribution that North America plays within the refugee regime, it's not just the contribution of North American states providing funding, or North American states providing solutions through third country resettlement, although those are critically important. If we look at the history of the refugee regime, where North American leadership has been really powerful is in bringing new ideas, in pushing the limits of who's covered by the refugee regime, who participates in the functioning of the refugee regime, ways that issues of refugees are linked with other issues of development and peace processes. We've seen this since 2015, not only with Canada and the United States, but Mexico as well, leading on negotiations of new agreements in the form of the global compacts, both on refugees and of migrants. And again, it's not just North American governments, it's North American governments, non-governmental organizations, academics, refugee leaders, faith communities, and other members of civil society have been the source of ideas and innovation within the regime for decades. So from community sponsorship in the 1970s to the linking of humanitarian and development responses in the 1980s, to recognizing gender-based violence as ground for persecution in the 1990s, through the leadership on pushing the limits of where and how the global refugee responds to displacement, North American thought leadership has been a critical element in the progressive evolution of the limits of the refugee regime. So while 85% of the world's refugees remain in the global south, in major refugee hosting countries, in regions like the Middle East and Southwest Asia and East Africa and the Horn, our conversation today is to really say, where and how can North American leadership collectively, where and how can that make a difference in thinking of where the refugee regime and UNHCR as the core institution of that regime, where and how can that regime have meaning? Where and how can it deliver on its mandate of ensuring protection for refugees and finding a solution to their plight? And to help us answer that question, we have a truly exceptional group of speakers. What I'm going to do is call on them one at a time to first ask them to answer the question of what critical issue or opportunity relating to the mandate of UNHCR do they think we can help address within the next 10 years? What should be on our agenda? I'm going to ask them each to answer that question in 4 or 5 minutes. And then we're going to turn to the question of how we go about realizing that kind of collective response that we're hoping to see. And the first person I'd like to call on is Canada's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Bob Rae. Ambassador Rae has a long background on these issues, but very recently in his report that was delivered in August of 2020, making fantastic recommendations on the way that we should think of refugee situations, not just as a humanitarian issue, but linked to much deeper issues, also building on his experience and real thought leadership in Canada's response to the situation of Rohingya refugees in Myanmar. So Ambassador Rae, welcome. Thank you for making time for this. I'm delighted to invite you to be our first speaker. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, James. I appreciate very much having the opportunity to join you. I'm joining you from my home office in New York, where, like many of you, I'm in a state of sort of modified lockdown. It's not too modified, more lockdown than modified. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to chat with you. And I'm going to start by saying that I have deeply appreciated the education that I've received from everyone that I've worked with in the last few years, focusing on this issue of refugee and the humanitarian, the migration crisis, humanitarian crisis that we are very much in the world today. I express my appreciation to James, who's after our first meeting gave me a reading list and off we went. My fellow panelists, some of whom I know well, Mustafa certainly has helped to teach me, and I've appreciated that. I guess I'd just make a couple of observations, which will not come as dramatic revelations to any of you, but I think are cause for some consideration. The first is that no matter how much money we give to UNHCR, there is no humanitarian solution to the humanitarian crises which have given rise to what we see around the world. And the reason, of course, is that the origin of every humanitarian crisis is a political crisis, or an economic crisis, or an environmental crisis, but one that has clear political consequences and overtones. That's the first rather obvious point. At the end of the Second World War, which is really the origin of the modern kind of refugee regime, I think it's fair to say that the displacement, the destruction that was caused by the events of the Second World War and the events leading up to the Second World War clearly struck hard at the notions of accountability. We created the Genocide Convention. You had the trials at Nuremberg. You had the creation of camps, but then basically third parties deciding over a period of time that they would try to figure out how to play a positive role in finding a place for people who did not have a place. When you look at the numbers of crises today and the degree and the extent of the challenges, one of the important things we have to recognize is that the length of time that people are spending in refugee camps goes well beyond anything that we experienced at the end of the Second World War. There's no comparison. The most notable case in point, of course, is the Palestinian situation as a result of the wars that took place in Israel, Palestine in the end of the 1940s, and that refugee situation has never been effectively resolved and dealt with. And so you have basically a situation which has lasted for more than 70 years. But that's only the most extreme example of many other situations that are now lasting 20, 30, 40 years. And I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about, as if you like, as thought leaders or as policymakers, is how can we address that? Sometimes the pictures in our heads are not really the same as the reality. Refugee camps have become large centers of population. They are not temporary. They are increasingly permanent. And then you have to figure out, well, how does one deal with the extent of the challenge? The first one has already been stated, and that is make sure refugees have a voice and have a place. Secondly, really begin to address the underlying crises, the political challenges that lie at the heart of why people are where they are. And the third point is, it's not just about giving people voice, it's about giving people access to work and access to education. Because if we leave people in a camp fed, but with nothing to do, we are treating people as objects and not as subjects. And I keep coming back to this point that we have to recognize the political nature of being a refugee, and the fact that being a refugee and being stateless should not mean you are voiceless or that you're not heard, and that your interests are not interests that have to be met by the international community, by host countries, by places of origin. All of these elements have to be part of how we deal with the extent of the refugee crisis that we're seeing around the world at this point. I'll stop there within my time. Thank you very much. Look forward to the panel.
That's terrific, Ambassador Ray. Thank you, Bob. These points, when we look at the examples of history of where solutions have been found, it has been within this idea of getting at the political core of the issue, this notion that there are no humanitarian solutions to political challenges. And the way that you've articulated that, I think, gives many of us tremendous hope, and for you to be advancing these ideas within the UN system. quite important. And that brings us to our next speaker, Beth Ferris at Georgetown University, who has really inspired me with her work over the years in moving between the power of research and using that knowledge as a way of engaging in advocacy and policy development. Beth is currently a research professor at Georgetown University, but the roles that she continues to serve with the Secretary General's group on internal displacement, her work at the Brookings IDP project was quite exciting. But then the work that she played as special advisor to the UN General Assembly Summit for Refugees and Migrants in New York that was held in 2016 was a moment where Beth really wrestled with the question of how do we take the tools that we have and try to make them work in a world where those tools are now 70 years old. And Beth's work on understanding populations in need of consideration and protection and inclusion that maybe weren't considered when the regime was established 7 years ago, I think has been really important. So following on Ambassador Ray's comments, Beth, let me turn it to you. What's a challenge that we can be working on and make some progress on within the next 2 years? Beth, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, I want to draw attention to the particular issue of people who are displaced who currently fall outside of UNHCR's mandate, in particular internally displaced persons or IDPs. You know, there are almost twice as many IDPs in the world as refugees. And yet, you know, we have a global refugee system. We don't have a global IDP system. It's really left the responsibility for IDPs rests with their governments to protect them, to assist them, to find solutions. And we can all think of examples where those governments are actually part of the cause of displacement. We still don't have it right with IDPs. It's been over 20 years since the guiding principles on internal displacement were presented to the United Nations. There have been a host of reforms, all of humanitarian reform. The development of the cluster system was intended to address the question of who's responsible for IDPs, but we still don't have a very good answer to that. We've gotten better at the humanitarian response, but we're lousy at supporting solutions for IDPs. And there are a lot of things in common, as Ambassador Ray just pointed out. The protracted nature of displacement means that humanitarians are really not the best place to find solutions for either IDPs or refugees. So I think when we think about UNHCR and how it will deal with IDPs, there have been a bunch of operational reviews in many cases where UNHCR is working with IDPs, particularly in countries where there are also refugees. But in terms of the institutional architecture, and particularly how to engage development actors. You know, we've seen some initiatives with the World Bank and seen some initiatives with UNDP and other development agencies, but there still tends to be this tendency to think, IDPs, humanitarian, we've got enough on our plate, let the humanitarians deal with it. So somehow I think we've got to deal with this question of, one, what is UNHCR's role vis-a-vis IDPs? Secondly, what is UNHCR's role within the broader institutional architecture? And by institutional architecture, I'm talking about the cluster system, but also other ways of engaging stakeholders, including IDPs themselves, in finding solutions for their displacement. And then thirdly, the question of, we've been talking about it as long as I've been working with refugees, which is an awful long time, is the question of the development humanitarian intersection, how to have better relations, how to have development actors be engaged from the beginning and not just be expected to pick up or carry on from humanitarian action. Now, this all becomes much more urgent, and I think actually much more interesting when you think about displacement that's caused not just by conflict, persecution, violence, but also displacement that's caused by disasters and eventually climate change. That whole issue of how UNHCR will engage with people who are displaced by climate change, whether they remain within the borders of their countries, which most will, or they cross over into another country. Now, I hope UNHCR will take a leadership position in this to recognize the legal gaps that exist and come up with some creative ways of dealing with it. I personally don't think a new convention on climate change displacement is going to go very far, but I think that some of the work that's been done by the Platform on Disaster Displacement may be helpful in this respect. James, when you think about this as the 70th anniversary of UNHCR, I suspect that when we're talking about the 80th anniversary of UNHCR, it will all be about climate change, about how climate change intersects with conflict, how governments are responding to it. And I think that it's time for us to begin serious thinking now about these issues in order that we're prepared for a future where many more people are on the move internally as well as across borders. So thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing about even more critical issues.
Thank you so much, Beth. I think that's a really powerful intervention. It's interesting, on UNHCR's 70th birthday in December 2020, High Commissioner Filippo Grandi sent out a text saying, as Julie said in her introduction, it's nothing to celebrate, and let's hope there is no need for a UNHCR at its 80th, at its 90th, or at its 100th anniversary. I think that's a hope that we all work towards, but given this complexity, it's such a Gordian knot for us to try and untie, and you've presented that in a very compelling way. And Beth, it links very well, this idea of how humanitarian and development responses have been linked before, connects us really well to what I'm hoping Leah Zamor is going to be able to help us understand. Leah, who's going to speak next on this panel, she's done some really fascinating work in looking at this bridging of the humanitarian and development issues back at her time as a policy advisor to the Deputy High Commissioner at UNHCR in Geneva, when Alex Telenikov was the Deputy High Commissioner. The work that she's done with Alex Telenikov, their co-authored work on the Arc of Protection, is a really important read that I commend to everyone. Leah is currently the director of the Humanitarian Crises Program at New York University's Center for International Cooperation. She's one of the leading thinkers on this question of how to link refugee responses with some of the development tools that we have, especially the work of the international financial institutions, the World Bank, and increasingly the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So Leah, question to you, what is the greatest issue or challenge that you think we can try and move forward on within the next 10 years? Over to you, Leah.
Great, thank you, James. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. I also must say that, as often happens when I'm on a panel or at an event that's so interesting, that everything that I thought I was going to say just goes out the window as soon as I start to hear people saying interesting things, which is a risky bet, but I am going to kind of take it. So this will be a little bit more ad-libbed than it might otherwise have been. I also just, at the outset want to say that the moderators have given the panelists a pretty tough challenge in choosing one key challenge over the next 10 years, given the number and the complexity of challenges that are facing the refugee regime right now, particularly, although not only since COVID. But I do want to focus on a specific issue, which I think is the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest challenges facing the regime right now, which is just the absolute economic devastation that's facing host countries. So as James mentioned, and I'm sure as many people know, most refugees are actually residing in a handful of developing countries that already struggle to provide services and protection and opportunities for their own citizens. And the world continues to ask them to also then host refugees without sharing that burden with them very well. And meanwhile, the economic situation in these countries is a kind of foundational driver, both of the politics of migration and asylum and refugee response in these countries, and also, of course, the sort of financial and functional solutions to what they can actually offer. So in that regard, I'm struck by a number of things that have already come up a bit. One, of course, is that we are here in sort of commemoration of UNHCR's 70th anniversary, and just to think about how much UNHCR has evolved and changed over those 70 years. And on this point, I think I would mention, because this is, I think that this is a part of UNHCR's history that's a little bit less known, which is that when it was created, it decided very quickly that it was going to be a pioneer in a kind of campaign for a more just international economic order, because it understood at the outset that the well-being of refugees was intimately linked, if not completely inseparable, from the prevailing economic policies and conditions in host states. So, I have one quote to read from the very first High Commissioner of UNHCR, and he was speaking to the General Assembly, and he was really trying to alert the General Assembly to the issue of the kind of macroeconomic situation in host countries. And he said, if the absorption of refugees into the economies of the countries in which they now reside is left to the normal economic processes, then the refugee problem will remain with us for the rest of our lives. Now, that's quite a statement in and of itself. It's particularly a statement for an institution that was given a 3-year mandate to solve the refugee problem. They had a $300,000 budget in 3 years, and they were told to solve the problem. And he was coming before the General Assembly and saying, you've set us up for failure. This will be a lifelong problem. And here they were really only talking actually about the post-war European refugee crisis. But he was saying, we cannot solve this problem if we do not also solve the prevailing macroeconomic conditions and problems in the states that most refugees reside. And that, I think, is a crucial insight, often an obvious one, but I would also point to the fact that he said the normal economic processes, that if they're allowed to prevail, we cannot prevail. And what he meant by that, and what he ended up going on to lobby for very vigorously and quite successfully, was that there needed to be a major stimulus, that there needed to be a major program of reconstruction into which refugees were included and absorbed. And that happened. That was the Marshall Plan. It was, refugees were initially excluded from the Marshall Plan. Through UNHCR and others, they were eventually included, and the post-war refugee problem was solved in that lifetime. Now, I think today, we need another Marshall Plan for refugees and the countries that host them, not just because that's the level of funding that's necessary given the kind of economic dysfunction and crisis in a lot of the main host countries, but also because the vision, the sort of economic vision that went behind the Marshall Plan, which was very sort of New Deal-ish, was exactly the kind of progressive economic vision that we need if development aid, if international aid is actually to redound to the benefit of refugees. And so that's the kind of history I think that can sort of be relearned and reabsorbed, not just about sort of the quantity of funding that we're talking about or the scale of the economic challenge that we're talking about, but also what's the vision that we're talking about. And the Refugee Convention itself is a New Deal document. It talks about the welfare state, it talks about Social Security, about sort of progressive taxation and equitable labor markets. And that, reinvigorating the role of UNHCR, I think, in that kind of discussion where it already has played that role before, it's certainly within the mandate of UNHCR to play it again, I think is crucial, particularly at a time when the other kinds of solutions like resettlement and repatriation, even with a new Biden administration, are really still off the table for most refugees. And so if we are talking about how can we materially and tangentially improve the living conditions of most of the world's refugees, we are talking about alleviating the overall economic conditions in those countries, which requires both more funding on the scale of a Marshall Plan, but also a new vision, I think, of to whose benefit economic policies need to redound.
Thank you so much, Leah. No, that was really powerful, and there's such an amazing connection between what you were saying and what Ambassador Ray was saying from the outset. The notion that we've known the logic, and to a certain extent we've had the tools, and so the quote that you read from the High Commissioner at the beginning of UNHCR's work, and how relevant that work is to the situation we confront today, how we need to gain courage from the history of where these issues have been resolved before. You know, we have faced large protracted refugee situations in the past. We have done it before. There are new challenges that we're confronting, but to build from that confidence of what has been possible in the past. So Leah, thank you for that. And we're going to come back to some of these themes, but transitioning now to another area where we have a history on which we can build, and that's the history of the role of refugees themselves within the regime. There was some interesting work recently by Tristan Harley from the University of New South Wales, looking at the role of refugees in the early development of UNHCR as an institution and the global refugee regime. To remember some of that history as I invite Mustafa Alios to join the conversation, someone who himself has made history. In December 2019, Mustafa Alio made history as being the first refugee advisor to a delegation at a meeting of the International Refugee System when he was advisor to the Canadian delegation at the Global Refugee Forum, making real this commitment in paragraph 34 of the Global Compact on Refugees that refugees themselves must be part of decision-making on issues that affect them. Mustafa is a dear friend and colleague who has shown such leadership and courage in demonstrating what contributions refugees can make, both in his work as co-founder and now as managing director of Jumpstart Refugee Talent, an organization that does incredible work in demonstrating the contributions refugees can make to the Canadian economy and address labor market needs here, but also in his work at a global level for the last 5 years with the Network for Refugee Voices, as one of the leaders behind the Global Refugee Summit in 2018, and someone who brings important experience and perspective on the questions that we're discussing today. So Mustafa, let me pass the floor to you. What's a challenge or an issue that we can try and address within the next 10 years? Mustafa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for attending. I could really echo a lot of the points that have been mentioned by fellow panelists, but I think I will take this as an advantage, trying to make it easier for me to focus on maybe one or 2 points. And I really, the point, and it could be obvious to many, is that actually the partnership or the role of refugees, or basically what UNHCR need to do, hopefully in the next 10 years, to transition from merely consulting with refugees to actually doing an equal partnership with refugees in creating solutions. And I think I always like kind of to start with some numbers in a way, just kind of to give a perspective and not only an opinion or observation from the ground. I mean, the first number that I want to give, and that's kind of basically coming from the, according to the UNHCR, that budget by end of 2020 was basically set to be, or the budget that requested by UNHCR was about like $9 billion. At the same time, yet, by the end of that year, it was only acquired about $4.4 billion. So there was about a 51% gap when we talk about, funding and support. I think the other kind of number that was estimated by the Sydney-based Institute for Economics and Peace, that was basically by 2050, we would expect about 1.2 billion refugees and displaced people. So this kind of, way, it's not definitely going easier, or even the numbers are getting less. I think really what those numbers could provide, and in a way, maybe the last more of an observation, but I hope even more research being done about it. That kind of refugee-led and local organization, especially when we're talking about the IDPs, where we see a lot of even IDP-led organizations taking on the responsibility of catering to IDP needs as of now, is that always for those organizations, cost is more of a lever than a barrier in that sense. Thinking of those kind of three concepts, what I wanted to bring is that definitely there is a need to solutions and new methodologies on doing more effective work with less cost in a way. It's giving. We're seeing the numbers of refugees are increasing, and unfortunately, by numbers, the number of people are decreasing who care. The people or governments who care about this are decreasing, or even the funding for it. And that kind of leads that UNHCR has to basically think of a different way of approaching those solutions with more effective, cost-effective, and more kind of flexible strategies and design. And I think the only way for that to happen, or maybe one of the main way, if I don't want to exaggerate this in that sense, is definitely it's building a stronger form of partnership and trust with refugee communities. It's not definitely unknown to many that there is always that kind of a trust issue between the humanitarian and the response in a way. And then investing, definitely what need to for that to happen is that UNHCR need to start investing in building refugee responses capacity and strongly consider transitioning from, again, as I said, merely consulting with refugees to create an equal partnership to address those needs, and then to create more programs that already refugee-led organization and local organization has proved that they can do more with less, and they can be a better designers of solutions coming from their experiences. And while we're seeing, maybe the last point I want to bring, while we're seeing a lot of increase today, and I'm grateful for seeing increase in terms of the conversation of including refugees and all of that, at the same time, it's really disappointing and frustrating to not see this translating from numbers. We've seen, for example, the last report from Amnesty that used to be 2% of the humanitarian funding going to local and refugee-led organizations. It went down to less than 1%. So, there is an increase in talking, but really there is a decrease in what the solution needs to be done. And it's interesting to hear a tip that coming from 70 years ago, and we're still trying to kind of discuss that, and then the importance of working with refugees in a way. I think the last 2 points, really quickly, I'm just going to read them out loud just because of my time, is definitely there need to be a serious consideration of including and recognizing environmental factors like the climate change as a driving force of displacement, something that need to happen in a way. And I think the last point is that there need to be developing a clear methods of responsibility sharing to respond to the current reality that most refugees would be hosted in poor countries. And it's not, as Ambassador Ray mentioned, this is not a temporary thing. This is going to be staying with us for a long time. So that shift of thinking needs to happen, and definitely a more responsibility sharing and more kind of effective methodologies need to be done on the ground.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. No, and thank you very much. Leah mentioned before, how hard it is to make the points that you want to make in the time available. It's my luxury as moderator to see the connections that are emerging out of this, and the conclusion that's emerging is really very powerful in terms of not shying away from the realities that we're facing, and not shying away from using the tools that we have. And Mustafa, to that, I think to recognize that including actors who have traditionally every day been at the front lines of those responses is really important. And some of those responders, and many of those responders are refugees and displaced communities themselves. We saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the second group that really needs to be recognized and empowered and held up are civil society communities, community sponsorship groups, who over the last 40 years have played a role not only in going beyond what governments are willing to provide in terms of solutions for refugees, but also in being the vanguards of a new political dialogue. Going back to the point that Ambassador Ray made at the top of the conversation, the central importance of political will to move towards solutions, and who is able to be that voice calling for solutions. As we've seen in Canada and elsewhere, it's those communities that are involved in the sponsorship of refugees. So with that, on that part of the conversation, to bring in my friend and colleague Jennifer Bond at the University of Ottawa, Jennifer plays many, many roles, and I don't know how she does them all and does them all so well. Jennifer is not only a professor in law at the University of Ottawa, but managing director of the Refugee Hub, wonderful group that links research and action on refugee issues here in Canada, but is also the chair of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. And from that first event, so many years ago now, to see what the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative has been able to do in building momentum, but also in finding ways to change dialogue. And so Jennifer, on that, building from Mustafa's point about the need for more responsibility sharing, the need for citizens to demand action, from your perspective, what can we be working on as a core issue or a core challenge within the next 10 years? Jennifer, over to you, please.
Great, thanks, James. And thanks so much to my co-panelists for fantastic reflections. And I'm tempted to jump into conversation and respond and engage with each of them. But I will take James's guidance and stick to my topic here. But I look forward and thank you for your rich comments so far. So James, I am actually going to take a step back from sponsorship to begin and think about that question around what can the UNHCR be focusing on in the next number of years. And I want to position the importance of rebuilding public and political support for the overall protection agenda as something that's absolutely critical. And I think that there is a real need to name that and center that, and to also acknowledge that's hard for the UNHCR to do, in part because it is so busy doing all of this other urgent humanitarian work and responding to overlapping crises that demand its policy and operational attention, on a consistent basis, and in part because it's got funding deficits and capacity shortages of the kind Mustafa has just highlighted. But I want to suggest that over the past 70 years, the erosion of societal consensus on the very idea of refugee protection has created a significant challenge for all aspects of our agenda. And it manifests itself in specific challenges, some of which we've talked about today, some of which we know are happening all around us. So the way that states respond on their national borders, the way that we see funding, realized or not realized, to regional responses, immediate crises, all other kinds of support. The fractured narratives, the deep politicization of this area, failed integration in our local communities, hate in our local communities. So many of these things that I think we identify frequently as discrete issues, in my view, can be pulled back to we've been fighting on all these small fronts, and we've forgotten about the centrality of keeping societal consensus and keeping buy-in around the notion of refugee protection. And so I want to center that and say, I think the UNHCR has to take that on. And I think if they ignore that, then there will be new manifestations of that erosion constantly, and we'll never be able to make progress across the agenda, whether it's protracted refugee situations of the kind highlighted by Ambassador Ray, or IDPs, or the many other topics that have been mentioned by my co-panelists today. So my second idea to share with you is that I think that one of the most powerful tools we have for trying to rebuild that societal consensus is, in fact, resettlement and complementary pathways, or safe and legal pathways. There's lots of names for it around the world, but really the idea that there's ways of doing facilitated transfer of refugees into our home communities. And what's exciting about those pathways to me is that they can be designed in a way that engages citizens in innovative and mutually supportive ways. And so you have pockets all over various countries that are having very intimate and sort of depoliticized experiences, which ultimately help them to become more engaged in the political rebuilding. So it's a cycle, but I think it's one we really need to recognize and acknowledge. So as you mentioned, I have the privilege of working on the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. It's a partnership that includes the UNHCR and the Government of Canada. And our mandate is to take the idea of refugee sponsorship and help governments and communities around the world introduce these programs. So we launched exactly 4 years ago this month. And I can say that in the last 4 years, we've worked with over 25 countries, and we've been successful in introducing programs in 15. What's exciting for me is not the number of countries that have come on stream. What's exciting, or even to be frank, the number of near-term protection spaces that has generated. It's the potential for millions and millions of people in thousands of communities all around the world to directly engage a newcomer as a new neighbor, to get to know a refugee in a way that isn't filled with all of the politics, and just get back to some human basics. And I think that helps us rebuild the political consensus that is missing, pardon me. So the third thing I want to suggest, and this is also hard, easy to say and hard to do, is that we need not only to acknowledge the deficit in this area and find the tools, but we need to make sure we center this as an objective when we actually get down to work of doing policy design and operations. And that's hard because the tendency is to focus on immediate protection needs, and there's good reasons for that. And then this becomes, well, a secondary benefit is it's good for host communities, or it helps integration, and it's sort of on the sideline. And that has implications on how we do our policy design and how we focus our operational priorities. So the last challenge I would issue to the UNHCR in this space is to say, recognize the challenge, take the challenge seriously, find persuasive tools, and then really center this as a core objective as you're executing on those tools. Keep it central. And I think that if we can rebuild public support, it will help us not only in the area of refugee resettlement and complementary pathways, but across the agenda. I see this as a way of getting support across the many areas that are of so much concern for all of us. So I'll close on that. Thanks, James.
That was fantastic, Jennifer. Thank you. It's so important the way you framed this from the outset is that we need to stop thinking of these as distinct issues, that these are issues that all come together that create the foundation upon which the work of the regime can actually happen. UNHCR has a non-political mandate. UNHCR has no power to find solutions for refugees on its own. It has a mandate to assist governments in that work. And so I think the way that you framed it is so helpful and powerful. And as I now turn to Anna for her intervention, it's looking ahead to the second part, and where we're going to be more conversational in our approach is really how do we go about doing this. So Anna is just the perfect person to help us think about this, not only because of her current role. Anna is currently a senior policy advisor with the Open Society Foundations and their International Migration Initiative. She's leading policy and advocacy work in the context of Latin America and really thinking through this idea of a corridor or sort of a continuum between the issues that we see in Central America, in Mexico, in the United States, and in Canada. But Anna also brings with her the perspective of what she did before joining OSF, and that's the perspective of having been an advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister and the G20 Sherpa in the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and how Mexico plays this arguably bridging role between the refugee hosting states and those that we turn to be the major contributors in terms of funding and resettlement spaces, how we break down that divide. So Anna's engagement of Mexico's relations with Europe, with the BRICS, with non-G20 countries provides a really important political lens in how we understand the potential for UNHCR's non-political mandates. So with that, Anna, welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you all so much. And I'm delighted to be joining such a wonderful group of experts. It's very tough to be the last one in the group. But I thought about this question, as James said, from the perspective of the challenges in Mexico and Central America, which is, of course, a mixed flow situation. And before talking about the how and some of the political dynamics of how we might address some of these issues, I wanted to say that I think the key opportunity or challenge today for UNHCR is the need to address the systemic protection challenges in this corridor and from all the way from Central America to Canada, and to do so in a sustainable way. As I think we are all aware, protection standards in this region outside of Canada have eroded during the last years. Programs like the so-called migration protection protocols, the asylum cooperative agreements with Central American countries, and other practices have been damaging to refugees and asylum seekers and to the asylum space more broadly, and have led to practices that limit, to say it nicely, but really or altogether deny the possibility to seek protection in the region. And so these actions have not just been inhumane or immoral. From a migration management perspective, they have also not been effective. And I think that's also that political leaders in the region understand well. So after yesterday's inauguration of a new administration in the United States, I think there is political opportunity to consider a different regional approach in partnership with regional governments and actors, understanding their limitations, understanding the conditions on the ground, to really think about what can we do to improve migration management while affording protections in the whole region, including increased access to asylum, expanded resettlement pathways, and as Jennifer mentioned, a host of complementary pathways to protection options. I think in this context, the UNHCR has a window of opportunity, and I will qualify it is a temporary, fragile, not infinite political window to propose actions, bilateral, regional actions, as well as to revitalize already established regional mechanisms like MERPs in a way that leads to protection outcomes. To mention one example where I think UNHCR should lead or have a prominent role in regional engagement. As part of the series of announcements that the new US administration made yesterday was an intention to stand up processing centers throughout Central America with the purpose of registering and processing displaced persons for refugee resettlement and other migration avenues, either in the US or in another partner country, arguably Canada, maybe Mexico, South American countries, maybe others. And this is an important development that could present opportunities that could expand the protection space in the region, but that could also go very wrong if we look at other examples of this being done, for example, in Europe and other places. And it will require substantial, genuine, grounded regional engagement to develop partnerships with countries throughout the region, to think about what kind of relocation programs are needed for people awaiting transfer, to think about what pathways are available to provide meaningful protection, whether it is according to the 1951 Convention or in a more expanded sense as Mexico does and other countries in the region do, and as it is often necessary when we're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of people in need. So I really think that the UNHCR can use this current momentum behind regional solutions to expand protection space in the region. So in 10 years, people have access to more and better avenues to protection. And I'm happy to speak a little bit about the how after this.
Thank you, Anna. And what I would like to do is now we're going to come right back to you on the question of the how, because I know that you have ideas on that. And what I'd like to do now is turn to this question of, how can North American actors, not only states, but also civil society actors, researchers, other organizations, how can we work together to build on this history that Leah and Beth and Mustafa have talked about, the kinds of opportunities that we have, that Bob and that Jennifer talked about, and as Anna said, there's a real moment right now. How do we make the most of that moment? But as I ask you to respond on that, let me add in the first few questions that we have received in the Q&A box. And I invite those listening to make use of the Q&A box to add your questions. Because our speakers have been so fantastic in sticking to time, there will actually be time for discussion. So as our speakers think about how we actually move forward, what does a collaborative North American approach look like? Not just a US-Canada approach, but a collaborative approach that spans North America, that goes to a whole of society approach. What does that look like and what can it achieve? But as you answer that, consider some of the questions we've had in the Q&A box and on Twitter. A question that came in on Twitter raised, it's all well and good for North American states to talk about these issues. They've done such a job of keeping refugees contained away from their borders. So is there something that North American actors need to think about in terms of humility in the way we have conversations with the largest refugee hosting countries in the world, like Turkey, the highest per capita hosting countries like Lebanon? How do we keep that, our geographic privilege in mind? Craig Damian Smith asked the question of how we address the politics that there are preferences for some refugee communities over others, that some refugee situations get more attention over others. There was that links to a question that we received from Christian Wolf, I believe still in Geneva, Christian, who is one of the few people that really followed both the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees process. The concern that the way we approach responses reinforces a dichotomy, that those who fit categories for resettlement, for example, are deemed to be those that are deserving, and those that take agency and move spontaneously can be contained. And then lastly, a question that was raised in the Q&A box about, we're talking about engaging in issues of development. If UNHCR has a non-political mandate in terms of the way that it responds, recognizing that the politics of education, the politics of access to employment, these are deep, thorny issues. Can UNHCR be expected to engage with these issues on their own? So as you reflect on how we move forward, what a more collaborative approach might look like, think of how these thorny issues also play a role. Anna, we're going to come back to you because I know you've been thinking very carefully and systematically about what a joined up continental approach might look like. So let me start with you, Anna, for your thoughts on this. And then Mustafa, I'm going to come to you because this is something that you've been trying to navigate as well in your work. So Anna, first to you, please. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you, James. There's so much to say about this, and I think all the questions are right on point. I think that it's a very basic thing to say, but I think that an important early step is to restart North America dialogue. The leaders of Canada, the US, and Mexico haven't met in over 4 years. They haven't had a space to align visions, establish priorities, and consider follow-up action, which is a very basic element in thinking about regional solutions, in thinking about joint up strategies. And there are several urgent issues beyond migration that require collective North America dialogue and leadership, including, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, economic recovery, and of course, migration. So even though there are some challenges to develop a smooth dialogue, and with that, I'm talking of my country, Mexico, the three countries share common interests and are interdependent. They will need to jointly consider their response to these issues and should really lead by example. I completely agree that it's very easy for some countries to say, you should be doing this. I will be sort of like leading what the solution should be, but it's up to you to implement it. And this is why I think it's really, really important to include from the beginning in a North American Leader Summit, Mexico, which is a country that has been so important, not just for transit migration, but also as an emerging destination country, and to follow any summit on on North America dialogue on migration with a regional summit that really includes other countries, not just the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, but to really think about who are the countries that are stepping up and are actually receiving a lot of migrants and refugees and are partnering with refugee communities and are partnering with other sectors like Costa Rica, like Belize, really should be part of the solutions and should really be part of the design of what regional strategy should look like. So starting with a North America Leaders Summit, what should that summit do? On migration, it should really champion North America cooperation and leadership, and with that I mean funds, and I mean setting, leading by example on regional solutions, acknowledge the continuous nature of migration in the region, and to really agree on an initial set of investments and steps to expand, normalize, and improve channels that meet the needs of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, and that will include, of course, IDPs. As I said, this should be followed with a much broader regional engagement. I think this would be an important symbolic gesture that there is political will, which is, of course, super important in the region, to approach regional protection differently. And the momentum of a successful meeting could really spill over into the Summit of the Americas, which is a meeting that is going to take place in the US in the second half of this year, and where countries can actually come and showcase early actions and successes that can really continue this agenda. I'll close by saying that I think that's what, and this is obviously something that's going to be mentioned by my colleagues, but for this kind of regional dialogue and commitments to be successful and meaningful, they should not only involve international agencies like UNHCR and multilateral development banks and all the big actors, but really partner closely with civil society, which is something that has not been done in a genuine way, and with refugee and displaced communities.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think the way that you've mapped out this very current moment, I think is very powerful. And if we think of the kind of momentum that was started in 2016 with the Leaders Summit, the notion of identifying that core group of states that can move forward, and for it to be not one state leading on its own, but sort of a coalition of states moving in a particular direction. Very hard to do within UNHCR's executive committee because of its structures and politics. But whether this kind of political moment can be seized, I think, is something we all need to give attention to. And you mentioned at the end that it is governments that can make these commitments, but there are other actors that can lend their voices in very important ways politically and morally as well. And so, Mustafa, let me come back to you, because there's something that you want to share in terms of the opportunity that you see for a joined up approach in responding to some of these issues. And so following on what Anna mentioned, and with some of these concerns about the dichotomy of so-called legitimate, illegitimate, what's your sense about where a more collaborative approach can start moving us towards change? Mustafa, over to you, please.
Thank you, James. I think I do agree with one of the comments in terms of the North American actors, or North America in general, where succeeding in trying to keep the refugee in terms when it comes to settlement a bit kind of not an issue for them when it comes to numbers. But yet at the same time, I strongly believe that North American actors can play a really crucial and critical role in leading initiatives and putting some ideas and influencing policies and solutions in the global south and in collaboration. And maybe kind of three things that I want to focus on really quickly. And the first one is definitely the refugee community resettlement programs. Something that, it's a model where you can crowdsource a refugee resettlement. Is something where you can actually get entire community to get involved in the work of protection. People, like even not only the civil society, but even the private citizen in that way. And I think there is a big kudo And thanks to the refugee hub team and even to Jennifer, because that kind of a model to be expanded and being brought to other countries and all of that is definitely promising things. And hopefully we can continue working on collaboratively, all of us. I think the second point is definitely, and Ambassador Ray kind of mentioned it, to transition from thinking of refugees as a subject to substance. And maybe one of the models was that most recently with Canada. And I think there was a similar kind of a concept being tried in terms of matching in employment in Mexico, so happened. But in Canada, the Economic Mobility Pathway program as a complementary pathways for refugees to be matched with jobs, and thinking of refugees as a skills and providers of contributors to the communities and economies in general. And we're seeing this, and maybe it's really good to mention that part of the economic mobility pathway, if many people don't know, refugee-led organizations and refugees were literally the catalyst of bringing this forward. It was the organization Jumpstart Refugee Talent in Canada that we led the conversation with employers in 2017 about this. It was Refugee Talent in Australia that also led this. It was the refugee leaders in Lebanon that created the first ever platform for data collection on this. And hopefully, it's glad to see this model basically being progressed. And I hope that even North American actors could provide an educational pathways to refugees, something that we haven't thought about much, but definitely there is an opportunity for that. I think the last one, but for me also is the most important one, is that Canada was the first ever state in history to institutionalize refugee participation. And this is something that we're very optimistic and excited about, but at the same time, it's a big responsibility that we're trying to move forward. There is a creation and a commitment coming from the Minister Mendicino and other ministries within Canada to work closely with the newly formed Refugee Advisory Network, a group of 12 leaders in Canada that would work with the government of Canada and to advise them and work with them collaboratively on policies and commitment for refugees issues internationally. I also want to commend LERRN on the playing crucial role, and you, James, in a way, just trying to advise and empower refugees on how to reach such a level in that way. And also maybe the announcement that I want to make on this, I've also kind of been humbled to have been offered now to lead an effort to hopefully institutionalize refugee participation in about 20 other countries than Canada, to bring that level to other states and work with refugee leaders in those states to provide them the support to basically amplify their voices, and at the same time to learn from them and to bring even forward the case on how can countries and states and policymakers and research academia and civil society and refugees can work together to create a better change. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not always that when we talk about, refugees need to be part of that. It's not about that, okay, then the civil society need to be out or academia need to be out. No, it's just the inclusion, that model of collaborative work that just yields into better results.
Mustafa, that's really exciting. And, how wonderful to hear that announcement here of providing mechanisms to ensure that refugee leadership in other countries is going to be part of the response. Ambassador Ray, I'm going to come back to you on this because I know that your time is limited, and you've been so kind to participate in this panel between many other commitments. But building on what Mustafa had to say and Anna's intervention, that it is this question of building up a strong chorus of voices to have the strength in numbers, to have the support of civil society, back to Jennifer's point about not viewing these as distinct issues. From your perspective in New York, where do you feel that critical mass can be brought together? What's the opportunity that we have, and how do we, as we've done historically with the the response to refugees from Indochina in the late 70s through the 1980s, it was this tipping point of demands from civil society and willing governments, and it was that broad cross section that came together to make the case, to make demands for solutions. While we still have you with us in this webinar to hear from you, what's the opportunity that you see, and how can the rest of us on the call, the 120 participants that we have on this call, where can we all put our shoulder behind this in moving forward towards solutions in a joined up way to make the most of the moment that we have in North America and globally? Can I give the floor to you, please, Bob? Over to you.
Well, a huge topic. Before I leave at the end of my comments, I just want to thank you and thank everybody for their inspiration and for the way in which they certainly broadened my thinking and feeling about this. I think the reason that this is a moment is because of COVID, and because of the fact that COVID has intensified the critical issues which have been described. Beth talking about the growing challenge of migration and how migration is becoming increasingly significant. A problem that will be made even worse by COVID because of the economic impacts of COVID in the Americas and in Africa and significant parts of Asia. I think Leah Zamor talking about the need for us to think big about a new deal, a global plan that will go well beyond the scope and the parameters of the Marshall Plan in the late 40s and early 50s. I actually think these moments are here now. We've had a challenge to move it forward. I've had the benefit from the day I got here to being the co-chair of the Financing for Development working group at the United Nations, co-chairing with Jamaica and working in cooperation with the Secretariat on how do we create a global effort to deal with the impact of COVID, the health impact, the social and economic impacts, and the financial impacts. And frankly, the refugee crisis is not sort of apart from that. It's right in the middle of it. And this is why I think we have to think very, very big. But I appreciated very much the question that said, who the hell are you to tell Europe or Turkey what to do? And the answer is, we're not. I'm not, certainly not. We have to work in collaboration with others, recognizing that many others have done even better than we have, but recognizing, I think, the central point that Leah made, which is that we have to understand the crisis of underdevelopment is at the core of why there are refugees, but also why we shouldn't be pointing the finger at host countries saying you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this, and understanding the extent of the economic mobilization that's required. I think on a very granular, practical level, the one thing that we can do, and I think Canada can help to convene, I think we can use our convening power, not to preach, but to say, let's get some host countries, let's get some refugee groups, let's get the agencies together in one room, and let's talk about what is going to be required to find a solution. There are some mechanisms at the UN in New York. There's some mechanisms in Geneva. I think it has to be a truly global effort. But I think we have to see it in this context of the need, the global need, the desperate need for recovery and for renewal. It connects to climate change. It connects to the need for much greater efforts in terms of how we build back. You know, can we build back in a greener and more sustainable way? It's an exciting moment, but it's a moment that requires a vision of what's to be done that very much includes the refugee and internally displaced phenomenon. I think Beth's comment about the fact that we have to go beyond the traditional definitions of refugee and look at what's happening with displacement more broadly and understand that that's part of the crisis that we're facing. And it's not about, do we have something to preach? I don't think the solutions are it's not going to be one. It's not going to be one thing. Let's all do this. I think the elements that have been described help to bring it together. But I think we have to say, why is it a moment in New York for us to do this? Because this is the moment we're in. And after yesterday's inauguration, I hope we will have an American government that's willing to engage with all of us in helping to find the range of actions that are going to be required to make the world a better place. I'm afraid
Thank
I have
you
to go,
very
but
much.
I appreciate
Yeah,
very
no,
much
I
the
appreciate
chance to
that.
be with you.
Just-
Thank you.
I want to say thank you and know that there's a lot of us cheering you on. Thank you, sir. I want to build from that point because those of us who have worked on these issues for so long, trying to raise these issues in the context of New York with development actors and political actors and peace building actors, we know that so many of these issues reside within Geneva, and there's that divide within the UN system that needs to be addressed. And this brings us back, Jennifer, I think, to the point that you raised in terms of if we're going to address these not as distinct issues, if we're going to address these issues that are really sort of at a structural level, and there's my political scientist hat coming on, but that we're going to address these as part of that change in the structures within which we work. Leah, going back to the point that you made about we can't make progress on one issue without making progress on all the other issues that need to move together. So Anna, you gave us a vision of a moment in terms of a North American approach. Jennifer, I want to come back to you in terms of with the excitement from citizen groups, from community groups that you've been observing. Where do you feel that there's this moment for a collaborative approach, not just with governments, but with civil society as well? Where do you feel we can go next, Jennifer?
Thanks. So really big questions, and I'm struggling a little bit to pivot from what now feels like a much more narrow reflection on specific areas of potential collaboration in North America to I think what Ambassador Ray has encouraged us to think about, which is the biggest global frame for these questions. So maybe I'll start by responding to that challenge on the big global frame and your question that followed it, James, and then just close with a few reflections on some immediate opportunities that I think are important in the North American context. I think that I would echo the fact that we are in a moment of tremendous disruption. So I think that seeing this as a time of opportunity is critical. It's very difficult, quite frankly, I think for everyone from senior policymakers to community members to feel connected when we're all working from home. So we are all in these little bubbles where I think the excitement of this opportunity can be a bit difficult to grasp. So one of the things we have to do is keep reminding each other of the significance of this moment. I think it's a once in a generation moment. It is a once in a lifetime moment. And we need to recognize that and then figure out how we're very strategic because it won't last, as some of my panelists have already mentioned. Second thing is, I do think getting really big and really creative, it is always a challenge when you're working with big institutions and the system is full of big institutions, not only the UNHCR, but of course all the states and many of the CSOs that are large. It's difficult to move outside of the institutional frame and bring, genuine innovation. But I do think that's what this moment demands. We can dream big in this moment and try to figure out how we use the disruption to really fundamentally shift the frame, not to make small incremental chips, which is, sometimes what we need to do. I don't think that's this moment. This is the moment for really big ideas, transformational ideas, and transformative ideas. So I would encourage us to figure out, how do we, despite all the challenges that COVID has brought, tap into our ambition and our creativity, because that's what we need to be doing right now. And my third point is I do, as always, learn from and support Mustafa in all of the things that he reminds us of so eloquently, the importance of making sure that the people who are driving this agenda include, and in fact that we are led by people with lived experiences of displacement. And I think that this is the moment to again, not be incremental. We need to be bringing in new voices and that we need to center the people who are living these experiences. We need to really avoid institutional protectionism and try to listen to refugees, to people who have experienced displacement, also to big corporations and private sector and all kinds of other new entrants who can try to push us out of our comfort zone and think big and creatively. So I'll say that about the big questions. And again, just reiterate, I think it's really hard to do that, even in the best facilitated online sessions. James, you've done a wonderful job today. It is hard, I think, to be really creative and bold on our screen. And what I am craving is several days with brilliant people with flip charts, locked in a room. We can't do it that way. So maybe our first challenge is, how are we going to do it? Because the moment demands we do it. So I'll leave it there on the big picture, just to maybe spend 1 minute on a smaller piece, but I think it is important to emphasize, to come back to the agenda on resettlement and complementary pathways. I've already made the case that I think this is a tool that is bigger than we sometimes give it credit for because of what it can do on the public support side. We are entering a moment where the Biden administration is about to rebuild the biggest resettlement program in the world. The slogan of Build Back Better needs to come into play here. And Canada has a lot of experiences. The scaling we did in Operation Syria, directly relevant to that build in the United States. They've committed to introducing sponsorship. It's a moment for civil society across the United States to re-engage and take back this agenda. So to close on the image of Canadians in 2015 welcoming newcomers in airports, the entire country mobilized. We are on the cusp of that moment in the United States. And that is the challenge for everybody who's working in the sector. How does it become more about just arrivals? How do we use this to take back the narrative and make a fundamental shift as that program scales? And I'll leave it there. Thanks, James.
Jennifer, that's so important. And I think, as much as we make use of this space, I've been really struck since we've all moved online, those of us who have privilege to have a basement office, to be able to, good internet connection. But, Mustafa will echo the kinds of conversations we've been able to have. We've been limited by internet access and time zones. But the question is, how do we go beyond the formal agenda with, the dates and times and what have you, and have those conversations in the coffee hour, with the flip charts, but really say we can imagine what the big ideas are. The question is, how do we move the thinking on big ideas to the action on big ideas? And so I share with you the sense that there's intuitively, there's this extraordinary moment that's before us. And so some of Anna's points to say, let's look at where there are planned meetings to come. Let's think of the allies who are able to bring these ideas into those moments that we know will happen. And Leah, I want to come back to you on this because, some of the biggest bridges that we need to build are on these questions of the structure of the global economy. And in the context of COVID, in the context of one of the questions in the Q&A box around vaccine nationalism, around, building a new global economic order is very challenging given the current context of mobility, but also the rise in populism that we've seen certainly since 2008. So Jennifer's point on let's not treat these separately. Let's make sure that we're building that base of support and addressing questions of narrative as much as we're addressing questions of policy. You've been thinking about this quite a bit. Where do you feel that there's room for us to join up together and to try and respond to these points? Over to you, please, Leah.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for such a thought-provoking question. First, just to reiterate, I think what Ambassador Raya and Jennifer just said, which is this idea that COVID is an absolute calamity, but it is also an opportunity, perhaps a generational, if not a lifetime one, if we can get it right. because it has really exposed in a way that I think, the evidence was already there, but now it's indisputable that the status quo ante was not working. It was not working for the majority of people on Earth. It was really not working for the most vulnerable people on Earth, including refugees. And so what can we do about that? And there is this kind of, grabbing, not wasting a crisis, for instance, is a very sort of traditional Keynesian idea. But we do seem to be at a moment, particularly on the economic front, where new models seem possible. And so on that score, I would say two things. So one is that I have sort of suggested this idea that we need a Marshall Plan or a New Deal for refugees and host communities. I really absolutely believe that. I also think that the main problem is not financing. It's not actually money. And I say that for two reasons. One is that there's just not a shortage of money right now. The problem is the distribution of money, that too much money is in the hands of too few people, but that's a distributional problem, that's a policy problem, but it's not a we don't have enough money to do the right thing kind of a problem. The other one is that we already have the tools to sort of revolutionize the international economy in ways, that can be done piecemeal. We can do things one at a time. We can take things as they come. I'd sort of point to two things that happened in March that were not refugee related, but that were potential game changers and could be again quite soon, particularly given the change in administration in Washington. So one was that there was a discussion about whether to do a new allocation of what's called special drawing rights, which is a kind of, it's a source of, without going too much into it, but it's a sort of source of funding that is, that sits with the IMF. And it's a kind of unit of account and reserve currency. And in the history of the IMF, there's been these sort of allocations. It's essentially a kind of liquidity influx into the global economy that the IMF can do with approval from its board. And so if we're thinking, for instance, about what can North American governments do on this issue, one idea is not, we are barreling into a moment probably where development assistance is actually going to go down. And, the idea that we're going to get a Marshall Plan through development assistance in the next few years is a complete non-starter. But these, North American governments also sit on the boards of major financial institutions. They can use their kind of governance role to try to help steer these conversations. And there was this moment in March where it seemed like most of the world's governments that sit on the boards of the major IFIs were really actively contemplating whether to do a big infusion of these things, these SDRs, which would have given a lot of liquidity to developing country governments to finance basic things, vaccines, food imports, medical supplies, PPE, these things that we now all know are crucial. And that came closer to happening actually than even I expected. And the main block at the time, as far as I know, was the US government, which of course has a very big role in the IFIs. And so with a new administration, I think there's a huge opportunity to really think big about kind of a global liquidity infusion. Or if it can't be global, can we just get it focused on refugee hosting states as an acknowledgement of the global public good that they do, as a kind of, shoring up of the refugee regime that's really on the brink at the moment. The other one is debt relief. And again, there's been more progress on that front than there had been previously. It remains absolutely crucial. I mean, if you want a real Marshall Plan for a country like Lebanon, the government of Lebanon spends about 50% of its budget every single year on debt repayment. So if you give it some real debt relief, you don't need to give it actually extra ODA or development assistance. All of a sudden its budget is doubled. And now you can condition that on, for instance, the inclusion of refugees into education systems and the rest of it. So there's a way to create, or not create, but really just, it's about rechanneling. It's about redistribution of the wealth that this world already has. But we have these kinds of mechanisms. And again, these are conversations that hadn't gotten far before COVID, that really seemed, there was that moment in March where radical ideas were really being talked about. I think we could get back to that space because the economic crisis that COVID has precipitated is just really unprecedented. And we're only beginning to see it. But that there is a way to think big even within the political realities that we know that we're operating under, which is that there will be no big increase in development assistance, it's likely to go down. But that there's other ways of creating a kind of mass stimulus that we could pursue, and that we need to pursue if we really want to material and tangentially change the living conditions that refugees are living in.
Thank you very much, Leah. No, and I think, the conversation between Jennifer's focus on, we need the big vision, and your articulation of how we can have a big vision and work towards that with these very tangible steps that are before us. I'm not going to try and tie this together. And what I want to do is call on Beth Ferris, someone whose view on these things has always been important and helpful, and drawing on a deep sense of where, some of these questions are new, not all of them are new. Beth, I want to give the floor to you, and then after Beth, we are going to move to some concluding comments. But Beth, I want, with your perspective of having worked on these issues, especially from a civil society perspective, from the work within the UN system in New York leading up to 2016, but really the work on advocating the long, hard slog for recognition of the needs of internally displaced persons, and bringing these populations that are often excluded, and over 15, 20 years in actually seeing perhaps some progress on that. I can't let the moment go to not mention Gil, but my dear friend and mentor Gil Loescher always used to say, lasting change takes time. So how do we start realizing that lasting change? Beth, I'd like to give the floor to you, please.
Thanks. I would really want to pick up on some of the ideas that have been mentioned. First, to strongly endorse Anna's suggestion for a North American approach to Central American migration. I mean, we need that urgently, and not just the governments, but civil society, academics, and so on. And I really hope that we can make this happen soon, because it's really urgently needed. Just responding to it piecemeal just isn't working at all. Secondly, I really like Leah's comments right now, really non-traditional thinking about how to get more support to refugee hosting countries. I think we have to move beyond just calling for more humanitarian assistance. That becomes standard in lots of different meetings, but to really look at some of these IFI instruments that could be used to do so. And Jennifer's point about really building a constituency for refugee protection in our countries. I'm encouraged, and you are too, I'm sure, that the U.S. resettlement agencies are looking very carefully at Canada's model to learn from Canada. We have a problem with healthcare in our country, which is a real stumbling block for private sponsorship, but hopefully there. And I think North American countries generally, particularly Canada, but maybe also will happen in the U.S., to really give more emphasis on refugee-led organizations, to include them in delegations, to insist that they have a seat at the table, to really use the possibilities we have to push for that kind of structural change. In addition to all of these suggestions, another way I think North America could make a contribution to dealing with future challenges is the whole idea of climate change. I mean, one of the things that's different about displacement caused by climate change is that it isn't just something that happens in the global south. I mean, it's happening in the global north, and Canada, and the United States, and we certainly don't have the answers. But if we could model, try some pilot programs to plan for it, to work with mayors or indigenous communities that are already experiencing the pressures of climate change, that might be a way of stimulating the debate on these issues and encouraging governments everywhere to take the issue of climate change displacement seriously. So, I mean, I think that we've already got lots of good ideas to follow up here, and I'll leave it to you, James, to tie it all up with a pretty little bow and figure out where we go next.
Oh, Beth, thank you. No, and that I think that's so important. And Beth, in your last intervention, you really made clear, there's a whole host of actors that we haven't yet brought into the conversation. The questions of mayors, municipalities, the questions of indigenous communities, and how the struggle for rights that we see with refugees links to the struggle for rights that we see within reconciliation in Canada and elsewhere. off the top when I gave a land recognition that I sit on unceded Algonquin territory. That's a reminder of how the struggle for rights and solutions for refugees is linked to so many other struggles that we have around us today. What I take from this conversation is, this need to have the big vision that Jennifer was encouraging us to have, to take confidence from what Bob Ray was saying about, that there is an appetite for that big vision to be articulated, that there's a need for thinking about how these dots can be connected and how these seemingly disconnected pieces can be brought together. We need to think on what that big vision approach is. And as we think about UNHCR's 70th anniversary, is learning the lessons of the organization in where change has been possible before. How do those lessons of change that has been successful, how do we learn those lessons to think about what's the big vision for the moment that we have before us now? But building from Leah and building from Anna, there is this question of identifying what those incremental moments for change might be. Where are there moments on the agenda in terms of, leaders meetings, in terms of, the G7 summit that's coming up with a focus on questions of climate, but clearly within the moment of rethinking a global economy, post-COVID. Where are these moments where this vision can be brought into that conversation? Where are the moments where those pieces, those foundations can be laid as we build towards this vision? But as we heard from Jennifer, as we heard from Mustafa, there's the question, and as Beth hinted in her last intervention, how do we make sure that as we're articulating that vision, that everyone who is around that metaphorical table has a voice in terms of the refugee leaders, host communities, civil society actors, faith-based organizations? One of the questions that we didn't get to that came in the Q&A box is the role of the private sector as being great disruptors and ideas of change. Something that Emily Arnold Hernandez from Asylum Access has mentioned is how within the private sector that there's a greater tolerance for risk. Is that the kind of approach that we need to take, is a willingness to take risks and to move towards change? But I think my last point is to say that, as the political scientist Sidney Tarrow said, that we can't just be focused on trying to create opportunities. We need to seize the opportunities that we have. So we need to be thinking about how these ideas of a big vision and an incremental approach of all the actors that need to be brought together, how do we have that coalition that's able to both seize opportunities as they come? And Anna's vision of a continental approach seems to be the place to start. How do we seize the opportunities that are yet to come while continuing the work to build that consensus that can create the opportunities that we still need? This has been really powerful and very inspiring. And Julie, I'd like to turn to you for comments as a way of ending us off, and then I'm going to do the very boring task of doing the last bit of housekeeping. But Julie, from IDRC's perspective, these questions of development and integration, of amplifying the voices of actors who are often lost, this is really at the core of what IDRC has done. So Julie, it's a pleasure to turn things back to you for your concluding comments before I wrap things up.
Thank you so much, James. And I fully agree that the conversation today has been extremely powerful. I think that we have really narrowed down on the critical elements that are needed to improve the way UNHCR delivers on its mandate and how we can collectively address this crisis. And the fact that we have focused on a North American point of view is extremely relevant. We have now this window of opportunity that has opened, hopefully, and will carry on being open for a bit longer so that we can take advantage of it. But it's definitely important for us to focus on that big vision that was identified, and the incremental approach that's proposed needs to be further explored. So having the input of the panelists today, I think, really builds on the importance of continuing to learn and to do the research that is actually what IDRC is committed of doing by continuing its engagement on those forced displacement issues. And what has remained central at the way that we approach this issue, and that is also similar to what has been said today, is the centrality of having refugees' participation into the conversation, into the finding of solutions, and into the implementation. So for us, it's very reassuring to know that there is this mobilization that continues around the issue, and that we are looking into progressive ideas as to how to solve this global challenge. At the same time, we will be also continuing to support the way that these efforts are conducted, and in a way that we try to address it across hemispheres. So bringing together the global north and the global south through the research and the communities. So an enormous thanks to all the panelists for their exceptional contribution today. I think, well, I've learned a lot, and I believe that we have all taken something of critical importance from the conversation today. In terms of course of the continuation of the discussion, there is other seminars of like this one that will be following. So James, I'm sure you'll be talking about those in your concluding remarks as well. But again, very, very warm thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And yes, in the chat box there, I have the link to the LERRN IDRC webinar series. We are so grateful for the collaboration with IDRC. There will be a monthly webinar series, one in February, one in March, focusing on issues of host community perspectives, of research perspectives in major refugee hosting countries within the Global South. Please look for updates on our website. You will receive a survey at the end of this webinar. I'd encourage you please to complete that survey, and within that also if you would like to join our mailing list to receive updates, our newsletter, which has just been published, please do send an email to learn@carleton.ca to receive updates. In terms of next steps from this webinar, the discussion has been incredibly rich, and it's extraordinary to see the thread that has gone through the topics that we have discussed. This idea of articulating a big vision and then having a collective strategy on how to take the steps that are needed. Jennifer, your comment of not just chipping away at the margins, but really thinking big of the moment we have, that's the challenge that's before us. We will be preparing a report from this webinar. The process is that the report from this webinar will go to UNHCR's standing committee. And so there is an opportunity there for these ideas to be communicated, but we will be following up with the presenters. We invite comments back from all of you within the webinar and to follow up with ideas that you have. My thanks to IDRC, to Julie for co-moderating this event with me. My real thanks to the panelists who took on this impossible task of answering these massive questions in such a short period of time, but did so well. So to Bob Ray, who has with another meeting, but to Jennifer Bonds, to Beth Ferris, to Mustafa Alio, Anna Makaze, and to Leah Zamor. These contributions were fantastic and will be a real, a real motivation as we continue this work and think how we move forward. And I look forward to collaborating with all of you to make that happen. I do want to say a special word of thanks to two groups of people that made this happen, working behind the scenes for weeks now in pulling together the technology of hosting a webinar with more than 150 participants from around the world. The team at LERRN with Nadia and Jennifer and Richard and Stephanie and Rowan and Rachel and Sahila. Everyone, this has just been extraordinary. But the idea of dialogue is often blocked by language. And so I would like to end by saying a sincere thanks to Sergio, Manuela, Claudia, Belen, Ramon, and Clark, who have provided our interpretation today. It hasn't always been easy, but you are tremendous professionals, and you bring us closer to that moment where we're able to speak with each other, not at each other. So, merci beaucoup, muchas gracias, thank you so much. For everyone who's watching, wherever you are, please stay safe, please stay well. We look forward to hearing your thoughts in the survey when this webinar concludes. We look forward to seeing you in our next discussion, and we look forward to carrying on this conversation together. So thank you, everyone. Have a marvelous day. Bye-bye now.